Okay, so I wanted to take a look at the Kingdom of Heaven. I'm not going to be able to play all the scenarios of this. May not even be able to get through one. There's kind of a time limit here. But I've set up the first introductory scenario. I'll give it at least some coverage here. This is... the reason I can't play is I've got the EU thing going on in my main room. I'm only going to have one day tomorrow really to play today. I set it up, but I'm going to be, I think, going out tonight, so I probably will not get a chance. And I may not be in shape tomorrow, but at least we can get kind of the introduction to the game out of the way. Alright, so this is going to be, first of all, for me, this was I think one of my very first pre-orders that I put into play, and really long awaited, obviously, because we're talking 3 years ago or something. I don't know. I think it switched companies in there, just booting from Gamers over to Multiman or something like that. I don't remember the history of the whole thing. I do remember thinking I was never going to get it for quite some time. What we have here on the board, and this is kind of disturbing, is that there's no key, no terrain key for this. And it's kind of tough. There's also none in the rules, although there is a textual explanation of what's there. Sometimes I just skim text and don't read it very carefully, and if you watch my videos you understand that, because I don't get the rules always very right. Oh, so a quick overview of kind of what we have on the map might be useful here. The different players have their own little sections which have separate force pools and then dead piles where eliminated units go. I'm assuming eliminated units can be brought back under certain circumstances, but the force, well, I know they can. The force pool allows units to be recruited from it during the mobilization phase. We have a number of spaces on the board, and blue, from what I can tell, indicates that it is a port space, which can have certain effects. If it's not blue, it's not a port. You have these provincial boundaries in kind of red. These dashed red lines are a couple of special movement areas that require a 3-point card to even use. The little suns and the little mountains are exactly the same. They're harsh terrain. They're going to affect your attrition. This green line here, or blue line, or whatever, is an indication of the Nile flood area. That's not going to be in effect in this scenario. There's one scenario, I think, where the Nile is allowed to flood late and cause real problems that way. Like most point-to-point CDGs, there's little lines indicating what's next to each other. So far, I don't see anything that makes me kind of go, oh my god, what's going on here? Oh, things like this. There's kind of this feeling of, I don't understand the terrain all that well. I've got to clear pieces away to really get what's near what, perhaps, or spend a little bit more time to understand that than I like to. And that's usually available in a hex or an area game. What else do we have? These little numbers, I think, are victory point spaces. We got these off-board spaces, Constantinople, Mosul, which only one player can use. Placed to indicate incoming fleets. They're not going to be used in this first scenario, I don't think. And what else? So at least, yes. These weird connections here with 3 lines in them and a little brown one, those are mountain pass connections, and those have certain specific effects on movement and combat. Okay. The actual playing pieces have, well, a number of different things. A little icon to indicate who's who, wording to indicate, again, who the power is. Here's a little problem. We got these little red crescents here. Well, that's different from this, even though they both have the green Muslim Islam symbol on them. They also these little red crescents are different from this guy's little symbol. But here's what's weird, really weird. The little flag symbol on the leader is different from the symbol on the unit. Not the symbol itself, but the color, the background, etc. That took a little bit of getting used to try to sort out who belongs where. And I'm not sure how well I got that. Things aren't divided correctly, completely by color here. Color is a general indicator, but it's not the be-all, end-all. So, for example, the Fatimids are their own color, and they are fairly neutral. But in green, you have Seljuks, Damascus, Aleppo. Each of these is its own power and can be eliminated on its own, and there's not a lot to distinguish them from one another. These little markers here are for castles, which have their own intrinsic defense. I think they're also used as control markers when you take a city, but I'm not sure about that. Cities and castles are kind of weird because you can occupy somebody's city or castle space without necessarily interacting with it, which makes sense, but there's not a good visual in this game for handling that in, say, the same way that Crusades had with its big hexes where you could be off to the side, and a couple of others, I think Onward Christian Soldiers also has that. A number of other games have this kind of, yeah, I'm there, I'm not sieging it kind of feeling. You don't have that here from what I can see. We'll see how that plays out. We got our Byzantines down here, and our Armenians using the same color again. And the Crusader states all pretty much use red. Doesn't guaranteed to be allied or involved in the war at any given time. In this particular scenario, I think that everything blue and red is Crusader allied all the time. Everything green is always going to be allied together as Muslims. The Fatimids are kind of a neutral, but there are other scenarios where these are going to be kind of mixed up, and I think the choices of not using more color differentiation or some other form of really making those stand out and say, I'm not the same as the guy next to me, would have been helpful. Cards themselves, well, I've got one example card here because this comes out of play. It only comes in on turn 2 in the scenario I'm playing. Someone claimed they really, really love the graphics on these. For me, it's a little busy. It's very pretty artwork, but between the wording, the texturing, the little space here, there's a subdued view to it, but I don't feel like it really kind of bounces out the way some of the CDGs really do, where you know how many ops points you have. You kind of have to look at this a little longer than I like, and you kind of have to, the text, etc., kind of all bleeds together in my head, at least. Again, not necessarily, a criticism here of any import. We'll see how it plays out and how much it affects me as I'm going. But I like to point those things. Oh no, cities are used with these little markers, which I haven't put on the board yet, and I have a number of other, I haven't pulled all the neutral markers out, so I haven't completely set the scenario. Okay. So, you also have a player aid card, which gives you your combat tables, and pretty much a lot of the rules that you'd have to look up in some cases to find out how they work, but probably with my knowledge of CDGs as of this point, this is not going to be sufficient, and you're going to be paging through the rules continuously, or I will, to try to find out some specific little piece. Okay. So let's see if we've got a sequence of play. We do up here, replacement phase, mustering, deal strategy cards, determine initiative, strategy phase, and demobilizing the forces. One interesting thing about this game is that every turn your troops kind of have to go home. Certain forces are more susceptible to this than others. For example, the Crusaders don't have anywhere to go. But once Kingdom of Jerusalem is formed, the Christians there, for example, will be returning to their manors, etc., and taking care of what they have. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what happens here during mustering, which I believe is the first thing. No, we got a replacement phase first. I'm going to find this, the glossy rule book. I don't like glossy, but so you get replacements, and that's going to be at your replacement rate, which is based on the scenario. And those are units coming out of the dead pile, and they go basically into your force pool at this point. You could also improve units directly on the map if you like, and you can spend to replace leaders who aren't particularly good if you've lost leaders and you need a replacement there. You can't replace in a blockaded city. Now, say, well, what's up with a blockaded city? Okay, blockade doesn't mean a naval blockade necessarily. What it means is a besieged, blockaded city where you're preventing the defender from getting his supplies. Well, once you can't do that with the ports so easily. You probably need an event card, from what I can see, to even accomplish that. If you don't have any points, you don't get any replacement points. Neutral units get their replacement points in an automated fashion. There are neutral countries. In this case, the Fatimids are neutral. They're probably not going to get damaged, and you can see they have their own force pools and dead pile. They're probably not going to get damaged until they're in the game in some way or another. So that's probably not a big deal. There's no diplomacy in this scenario, but there is in some of them. Okay, then we go to what? The mustering phase. And there's not going to be one on the first turn of the game. Now, for the mustering phase, you get all your leaders, you put them on the map in unbesieged spaces that you control, and then you're allowed to place units from your force pool into spaces controlled by the power. You can only have up to 4 units in an off-map box. Well, obviously, we've got that exceeded initially here. No more than 2 in a walled city, no more than 3 in the power's capital, etc. No more than 1 in a castle, and you can't put it in spaces with a besieged stronghold. So there's basically, this set of rules to what you can place. If you can't get everything on the board, they stay in your force pool. They're not dead, you don't have to recover them, but they're not necessarily available to you. And then there's some additional rules on that. Okay. Now, castles have an intrinsic stronghold or an intrinsic garrison. This guy's been reduced. That's part of the scenario rule. On his other side, he's got a stronger value. Is that a -1 on there? See, that should be a -1. Yeah, you can barely see the minus on there. Kind of annoying. Anyway, during your mustering, you can actually reduce some of your castles in order to build up your field army. And you can also do vice versa and reduce your field army and build up garrisons in besieged cities or castles. Cities do not have an intrinsic garrison, so if you don't have a garrison in your city, it's very easy to take it by siege. Okay. On the strategy phase, you have a number of different actions you can take. Now, this is your normal CDG type game. You have this choice between, do you want to pay your ops or do you want to play the event? Some will use both, but they'll specify that on the card. Okay, so you can use your operations points to activate a single leader whose rating is less. Now, damn it, I didn't pay attention to what's what on the counters. I paid attention to the regular units who have really a combat and a movement value, but I forgot about the leaders here who have a strategy rating, which is what you're going to have to play in order to activate them. They have a battle rating, which is a representation of their own personal prowess in combat and their local troops. And really, that's their combat strength. It's added to the combat just as a regular unit is. And then they have the command rating, which is really how many pieces they can command. Okay. Let's see, where are we here? Right. You can play for the event. You can resolve a siege, and in a siege, siege rules in this are really, really more detailed than in most games. In most games, though, you play a card to resolve a siege, and that's essentially what happens here, but you have more options available to you and more steps you have to go through. Some cards can be used for diplomacy. Now, I don't have one open, but on the upper right modifier, there's a diplomacy or on the upper right corner, there's a diplomacy modifier, which can be used in the diplomacy rules. We're not going to hit on those rules in my first scenario, which is supposedly a learning scenario. I don't remember how long it is. It's the first crusade, so it's not really what you think as the optimal choice for a learning scenario. I'm not sure why that was picked. It seems to me one of the more chaotic events that goes on, and one with a lot of special effects, but in the game rules it doesn't seem to have them, which may to me be somewhat of a minus, but it may actually be that the game focuses more on the diplomatic actions that took place in some of the other crusades. You can make a vassal move. This allows you to move a number of units equal to the ops value of the card, or you get an extra unit to move if everything's cav, and they don't have to start or end in the same place. If you have less cards than your opponent, you can make a free vassal move with one unit without having to play a card. Okay? So if you are weaker in terms of hand at that point, you can kind of delay things, not just pass, but you actually get to do something too. You can discard a card for no effect, and this can allow you to do an assault and a siege without having to take any chances on, say, a random card. If you have fewer cards than the opponent, you can also simply pass. But it seems to me you'd probably want to take that vassal move if you could. Bunch of rules on events, pretty much common stuff. The deck is a single deck, shared. It's reshuffled when emptied, and then there are certain cards which might reshuffle the deck again. There's an optional rule for combining cards. I'm not going to play with this, but an option for combining cards to give you more operations points, as it were, in a particular action. Okay. How about diplomacy? Because this is one of the interesting things in the game. Basically, a power is either aligned with the Muslim player. It's a two-player game. The power is either aligned with the Muslim player, the Christian player, or neutral. Now, you track these up here, and there's little diplomatic status boxes, and I could place those, but there's no diplomacy in this first scenario, so it's kind of, obvious who's what on the board, except for the Fatimans, who are neutral to begin with. All right. So you can shift the operations by using a card, and you use the modifier that'll be in that right-hand corner. Of course, here they say upper left corner, so maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe there's another number up there. Earlier they said right. There's no question there, though. And each power can be attempted to be influenced once per turn. It looks like, once successfully. And only powers listed in the scenario can be affected. The diplomatic marker, so there's a diplomatic advantage marker, which notes who has the most influence, and it starts out unpossessed, but you can gain it by capturing a stronghold that's a victory space and making a roll less than or equal to the victory point modifier of the space. So for example, if you capture Jerusalem, which has a 5 victory points marker, you have a good chance of getting the advantage in diplomacy. If you defeat an enemy who has a leader, you make a die roll less than or equal to the number of enemy units that you eliminated, and you get the advantage. If the opponent ends a siege on a victory space, there's a roll so you can get the possession of the marker. And you can play a diplomacy card to get the marker if you don't possess it. This is just like influencing a power. The modifier on the card applies. There's an additional +1 if your opponent has the modifier, and you need to roll a 3 or less to gain the marker. Okay, well, you can use Diplomatic Advantage Marker to get free passage from a neutral power. If played during your round, you must leave the neutral power by the end of the round until it's violated. This doesn't appear. Oh no, it goes back neutral when you play it. So if you use the Diplomatic Advantage for this, or anything, I assume, you're giving it up, and it becomes available to the other player. When you play a card for Diplomatic Influence, you make a die roll, and this is you add the modifier to the card. If you control that power's capital, you get a -2 bonus, and I assume the modifiers are negative for your advantage. There might be events in play, and if you have the Diplomatic Advantage Marker, you can expend it to change any diplomacy die roll by 1, either in your favor or against it. The scenario will give a target number to influence the power, and if you get equal to or less than that number, you get the power mark move 1 space in your direction, which means if a power is subjected to diplomacy, you can actually pull them out of the war as well as trying to influence them to join you. Anyway, if it becomes neutral, there's a bunch of rules to handle what happens to the power under those cases. If it becomes yours, obviously you can start using it as your regular units. So there's multiple activation cards in this game, like the campaigns and some other games that allow you to move more than one leader in a round, and you move each one completely independently as almost their own activation before you move the next one along. So there's no coordinated actions really in that way. Units have a movement allowance. It costs 2 to enter through the mountain passes. Okay. So what about command? So you have this command rating, which is how many units you can command, sort of. You're allowed to command 1 unit of your religion that's not of your power. Otherwise, though, you have to have everything under your own power. Now, in this game, that's probably not too tough because the Crusaders mainly are all Crusader units, with the exception of a couple of Byzantine units that aren't really worth much. It does mean the Byzantine leader can't command a large crusading army, and in fact, their religion is different, so they can't even command each other's troops directly. But a leader can command other leaders, and those other leaders can be from a different power or from a different religion even. And they're commanded using that same command rating. So for example, good old Tancred here could only command 2 units, but he could choose to command 2 leaders who in their own rights have their own commands under them. There's limitations to that, however, which involve who's outranks whom. So rank is determined as follows. A Crusader outranks all Catholic non-Crusaders. A leader from Kingdom of Jerusalem outranks all Catholic non-Crusaders other than that. And in the absence of the other 2, it's based on the command rating. A leader outranks any leader with a lower command rating. And the command rating, of course, is the number on the right. So Toulouse is the main commander of the Crusaders at the beginning, as it should be, and can take more of those leaders under his control. What it also means is no one else can command him, and no one else can command when he's in the stack. If 2 leaders have the same command rating and are same rank, well, then neither one can command the other. So there's a certain precedence issue there. You kind of don't want to be in that position because that'll hinder your abilities. Okay. Let's see what else we got. Mountain passes cost 2 movement points, as I've already gone into. They also prevent interception, battle avoidance, and retreats across mountain passes. Now, battle avoidance is a little weird in this game. For the most part, most of these things are similar to other CDGs, but battle avoidance has one major twist to it, which we'll touch on when we get to it. Arabian desert spaces, these 3 spaces can only be moved through with a 3-point card. Harsh terrain spaces, which are the suns and the mountains, force an attrition die roll, and they also cause modifiers to attrition. Attrition's a huge issue in the Crusades, for obvious reasons, really, but it looks like they go into a good handling of it here. We'll see how it works. It's something without a lot of wankiness going on like some games that I've seen on the Crusades. Okay. Now, you're forced to take attrition if you move through a space or end your movement in a space with an enemy stronghold, fortress, city, or castle, or with a harsh terrain modifier. Friendly strongholds negate harsh terrain bonuses, penalties for this case. So, for example, the Seljuks can move through here without taking a penalty. I'm going to take a short break so that I can swap bids. Okay, so for the attrition, you're going to roll on this attrition table, and basically you count up the amount of troops you have, and you take these modifiers to determine how far over. I think there's shifts to the I think there's shifts to the strength value of the attrition, and you roll a die, see how many step losses you take. Step losses, as usual, you flip a counter over, and then eventually it dies and goes into the dead box, and I hope I remember where this came from. Okay. So, and maybe there's more information here. Yeah, here are the penalties you take on different points, and if you spend turns in movement points in a space with a friendly stronghold, you can reduce your attrition value somewhat. Okay. Shift 1 column for every unit over 4. Yeah, okay. Alright. There's one other factor to attrition, which, well, there's 2 others. Both sieges and shadowing, which is one of the most interesting little factors added to this system. Every CDG has to add some neat little system to it, some neat little change from others, or at least those that don't want to seem, just vanilla, oh, this could be anything. This one added something very interesting where cavalry armies are able to kind of harass regular armies, which can include knights and such not. The cav armies are really the light cav of Muslims for the most part. And cause greater attrition losses. Of course, they take attrition losses themselves for this constant engagement that they're providing. And that's going to be an interesting little aspect to this, I think, that I'm really looking forward to. You can enter enemy territory or friendly territory. If you enter neutral territory, the neutral power aligns with the enemy. And, you're invading them. Unless you have the free passage advantage. This allows an interception, which is basically a die roll against what? You have to get the battle rating, or less, and you have some modifiers there. If you have a friendly stronghold, you get a bonus. If you're trying to intercept an all-cavalry army, you get a penalty. And if you're intercepting with a cavalry army, you get a bonus. 1's an automatic success, 6 is an automatic failure. And if you successfully intercept, his army ends movement, and the intercepting player is the attacker. This is very different from most games where the intercepting player is assumed to have stepped into some kind of great defensive terrain magically and can block the opponent by doing that. In this one, the interceptor really has to actually conduct the attack, for better or worse there. If an enemy enters a space containing one of your armies, you're allowed to try to move away, avoiding battle. This works much like interception. You roll a die, trying to get less than your battle rating. You get a -1 if you're cav. If your opponent is coming from one of your strongholds, you get a -1 bonus. If your opponent has no cavalry, And now, if your army has no cavalry and your opponent is attacking with an all-cav army, you get a penalty of +1. If your force is besieging an enemy stronghold, you get a penalty of +1. It's hard to, pull up camp from a siege. And if you're attempting to shadow and your opponent has any cavalry, there's a +1. Now, shadow is the special thing. When you do an avoid battle, you can declare, I'm shadowing. And you're going to try to move away just like anything else. You get a +1 penalty if your opponent has cavalry. You can only do this with a pure cav army. You move away a space, and then from then on you kind of follow his army as it moves. And as long as you shadow him even one space, you end up causing this special attrition roll, this special attrition modifier, which is going to be the strength of your shadowing force is added to his attrition roll. And you force an attrition as well if there wasn't one otherwise. If you avoid battle, you can't cross a mountain pass, enter an off-map box, all kind of little restrictions there. You can't go into an enemy stronghold unless you have a friendly unit present there. You can't try to swap with the enemy. A force besieging a stronghold may only attempt to avoid battle against a force entering the space via a land connection, and such attempt earns a +1 penalty. Yeah, we got that already. Alright, combining interception and avoidance, you can try to avoid battle with one force and intercept with another if you wish, and both attempts have to be rolled before any battles are resolved there, so you have to make the attempt. Okay. So one thing with battles to recall or to remember throughout the game is if you're moving and you fight a battle, you get to keep moving if you win. You don't get stopped by fighting a battle as you do in many games. If you avoid battle and end up moving through spaces containing harsh terrain, you get to make a foraging or attrition roll even though it's not your turn to move. Okay, so with the shadowing, let me step back into that roll because that's the next one here. You have to, every time the opponent moves, you get to move one space. And you have to maintain one space distance or else your shadowing ends. Now, you can't enter an enemy strong point while shadowing. In the end, though, it ends up being a modifier to their attrition table, but you have to take of your strength points, and you force an attrition roll. So even if they move through all good terrain, they have to count their strength points and your strength points and make a roll. As the shadowing player, you also have to take attrition though, but you only count your own strength points. The strength of the opposing army doesn't affect you. Actual battles. So these are going to be rolls, and this is all using a d6. I know this table looks bigger, but there's modifiers on it. You add up your combat strength, and you roll a die and see how much damage you do to the opponent. And there's modifiers here for failing to avoid battle, successful interception gives you a bonus, etc. All kinds of normal things. Whoever causes the most damage wins the battle. If you win a battle and you do at least double the step losses to the opponent, or if the defeated force has to retreat through an enemy through one of your strongholds, you get a pursuit roll, and you get to roll here to do additional damage in that case. So if you get a good victory in a battle, it gets better, and that's kind of a nice result there. Step losses are taken by flipping units or eliminating them. Leader casualties, if you're completely eliminated, all the leaders have to check to see what happens to them, and they roll in this little leader loss table, which is also over here. There are modifiers based on different values, and death, pretty obvious, you're out of the game. You could be replaced if you're a weak leader. Prisoner, you're available to be ransomed. And like in games like Here I Stand, the ransom involves you giving your opponent a card. You give him a free card selection in order that you can get your leader back. So he can't refuse this. You don't really know what you're going to pay. You can look at your hand and say, I got a bunch of weak cards. It's worth it. He's a good leader, whatever. But you don't know for sure what you're going to lose there. And normally in games where players can negotiate an exchange of leaders or something along that lines, it never happens because it's to one person's advantage or the other in a two-player game. Multiplayer obviously is different. This gets around that because, to be honest, these leaders were being ransomed off. There was no, it's in my favor militarily or for the victory for the game or whatever. There's no thinking of that. This was just done, and without a mechanism to enforce that, players will usually not engage in anything of that nature. And if the moving player won the battle, they can keep moving. It doesn't cost them anything. The losing player has to retreat, and he has some limitations there. For example, he can't go across a mountain pass, etc. And there's also some penalties. If he has to go through enemy units, he takes step losses for each unit in that space. If he has to go through harsh terrain, he has to take foraging as if he's moving. If he has to go through an enemy stronghold, there's a pursuit roll. All kinds of different little ways to hurt the person by pushing him through something he doesn't want to go through. It feels like there's too many cases there. I'm not sure. It's going to be tough to remember, so you're going to have to, after every battle, look up, hey, which space do I want to retreat to, because which one's going to hurt me more? And that's kind of, to me, a little painful. We've already largely covered attrition. One thing that's not covered is the movement from Constantinople to Asia Minor forces an attrition roll immediately, and that's done at +5. By the way, the attrition isn't by the strength of the units, and leaders don't count. It's just the number of units in the stack. So half-strength units are particularly bad for attrition. They're going to melt away faster. Okay, demobilization. At the end of each turn, there's sort of this period where you have to demobilize your forces. And leaders and the military orders is optional. You have to demobilize what? A leader that does not demobilize can retain units equal to half of his command rating, if he can command them normally, if he's the ranking leader in the space. Crusaders, which are our red units, and Mongols, which aren't in this game yet, don't have to ever, in fact cannot demobilize, even if they choose to. Neutral forces and leaders don't demobilize. The Winter Campaign card, if it's used, doesn't require you to demobilize, or allows you not to demobilize. Besieged units in a walled city don't demobilize unless they're no longer sieged during the demobilization phase. And in the particular case, because the Muslims have to demobilize first, where Muslim units are under siege, they wait until after the Crusader decides whether or not he's immobilizing to have to resolve their own demobilization in that case. And two friendly units can remain in each captured city if there's no leader present. This is not in addition to the above exemptions. It's only allowed if all other units have already demobilized. I'm not quite sure what that means. My initial reading was, well, if I take any demobilization exemptions anywhere on the board, I can't do this. But I'm beginning to think what it means is captured cities I can always maintain that garrison in unless I use a demobilization exemption in that city. Poorly worded rule, but I think that's the intention there, and that's what I'm going to try to play by. Okay. Alright, so this game covers sieges, cities, and castles in a lot more detail than some CDGs do and than many other games overall actually do. So, what do we got here? We got some special rules on Jerusalem and the kingdom, or the area of Jerusalem, which actually has two capitals. It has Acre and Jerusalem. I'm not sure I completely understand these rules. And what they mean. They seem to cover, if the Muslims own Jerusalem at the beginning of the scenario, no one can muster, or the Crusaders can't muster in Jerusalem as a whole, I guess. It's not clear because the city of Jerusalem versus the kingdom of Jerusalem, they don't specify those two differences. So what I think it means is you can't muster within the kingdom of Jerusalem territory if the city of Jerusalem's held by the Muslims. But it's not absolutely certain. Otherwise it sounds kind of like, well, the Crusaders can't muster in the city of Jerusalem. I wish they had used at least some sort of font to distinguish between the two. Okay. Cities and castles have a resistance factor. And this is an important value. It starts at a base of 3 for any city or castle. Now, I think a reduced castle has a resistance factor of 2 instead. I think that's what this number on here means. But I haven't really been able to dig that out, and I'm not reading too hard here. So, yes, castle on low garrison has that. So there are modifiers to this. Half the battle rating of the highest ranked defending leader is added to the resistance. If you have a good ruler, a good leader, military leader there, it's less likely to surrender. If the strongholds support the blue areas, it's less likely to surrender by 1. For every 2 steps inside a city, but not a castle, you get +1 to your resistance factor, maximum +2. If the stronghold's a castle on its low garrison side, it's a -1. That's indicated on here. If the stronghold is a Templar, Hospitaller, or Assassin castle, they start off with a higher resistance factor, and that's marked on their counters. Those counters are limited. You can produce more castle markers for everybody else, but not for those 3 because they're higher value. They have a counter mix limit to how many they can have on the board. Now in this game, there don't appear to be any of those, so we're kind of safe. Everything's pretty much the same. Okay, now when you're moving through an enemy stronghold, this is the first part of the weirdness in the siege rules. You can walk through it, pause, and tell them that they should surrender. And they might. They make a roll against their resistance factor. And if you roll higher than their resistance factor on a d6, they flip over to you. Bang, you just took them. You didn't have to fight. You didn't have to really lay down a siege. You didn't have to do anything. You just called for them to surrender, and they did. That's cool. And any troops inside give up? Any leaders are captured? Actually, yeah, I think they make a leader loss check. Okay, but there are modifiers to that roll. One of those modifiers is every time you fail a call to surrender, that's marked, I assume, on the game record track. And that's a penalty to every succeeding one. Once you capture a city, though, that penalty resets to 0. So if you capture it by siege, not by surrender. So resistance goes up as you're calling for more things to surrender. Eventually, somebody's going to hold out against you. I'm not quite sure what that's to represent and why that is important, but if one city resists, I think others sort of form together and say, hey, yeah, why are we just giving in, maybe? Okay. If the active leader has a battle rating of 3 or 4, though, he gets a +1 to his die roll. However, if he has less than 6 units, he gets a -2. And if there's a nearby unbesieged enemy army with a combat strength at least half of the active force, there's another -2 on there. So there's a good chance you might not even be able to take cities if there's enemies operating in the area. It's not an easy way to bypass, to get around an enemy force. It's a way to really capture stuff when you're alone in the area. And it's kind of sensible that they would withdraw it. Anyway, you roll that, and if it succeeds, the stronghold switches to your side, and the activated army must stop unless it was a castle and the final modified roll exceeded the resistance factor by 1 or more. Well, it only succeeds on a 1 or more. I don't know if they mean it has to go 1 higher than that, or, as written, hey, you took it with a castle, and, and that's just the way castles are. If you take a castle, it's free. I don't know which they mean. There's no way of really telling what their intentions were unless there's errata somewhere. I'll play it as written unless I find something otherwise. Okay, but with cities, you have to stop when you capture them this way. Yeah, you gotta loot them or something. Okay, well, if you can't win it with a call for surrender, your only other alternative is to siege the city. And for a siege, the first thing you have to do is you calculate the resistance force, which you probably have already done, to at least see if you can call for surrender, because why not at least see what the value is? And then the besieger has the possibility of being able to establish a blockade. Now, in order to establish a blockade, the stronghold cannot be a port. If it's a port, they're going to be able to get supplies in by sea unless you get navies into place. If it's not a port, however, you have to roll a die on what? Less than or equal to the, let's see. If the stronghold's not a port, subtract the number of units inside a stronghold from the number of sieging units. A castle counts as a single unit. You must roll that number or less on a d6. So if I have, 6 units besieging you, and you have 1 unit inside a fortress, I have to roll a 4 or less to establish a blockade. Now, the blockade is somewhat important because what it allows me to do is, first of all, it prevents any replacement points from being built inside the strong point. Siege events, some of them are going to be limited. Now, siege events, we don't have one here. They're going to be covered on some of these cards. There's a section of the card. Let's see if I can find a picture of it for you. There's a section of the card down here which has siege events. It might also have regular battle events down here. Oh no, that's another siege. That's a defender siege event. Somewhere or another there's battle events. I don't know. I think they're blue. Yeah, maybe played as battle event. Okay. Where the cards can be played for other than just their operations or event value. And in this case, in a siege, well, in order to play some of them, you need to have the blockade in place. If you have a blockade, you reduce the chances of a leader getting out of the city alive. And it's a prerequisite to doing the starvation action on a city. Now, to resolve the siege, there's 3 things you can do to kind of force it to change the situation. And then, whichever one you take, or you could just discard a card and take none of them, you can do an assault afterwards, which will be handled sort of like a regular battle. The first one's starvation. For starvation, you have to have a blockade in place, and the besieger plays a card of any operations value. The besieged force has to roll for attrition, and it adds that operation value to the roll. The attrition value is shifted a column to the right for every unit greater than 4 in the stronghold. So the more pieces you have in there, the worse it's going to be, beyond just how many pieces you have in there, which is your base attrition level. It starts, stacking up a little higher. But The besieger also has to make a roll for attrition with no modifiers, just his size. So that can weaken both sides, although it probably hurts the defender more because his troops are going to be more heavily protected within the city on an assault. And then you can siege after that. The intrinsic garrison of a castle will not take attrition losses no matter what. You must assault to take the castle, basically. Fortunes of War. If you don't have a siege event that you want to play, what you're allowed to do is discard any card, and you draw the top card from here. If it has a siege event on it, it takes place. It doesn't matter who it affects. So you're taking kind of a crap shot to try to change the situation. You could play siege events themselves. You play one from your hand, the defender can respond. You play one from your hand, the defender can respond. On the defender's turn, he could take an action to just play a single defensive siege effect, and there's no response to that unless there's a card that specifies that it is one. Okay. And then the final option here on the sieges is an assault. I'm afraid I'm going to have to roll the video again and put another one in place because I'm running low. Okay, and we keep going. So for an assault itself, it's going to be handled like a normal battle. However, the besieger's combat strength is shifted a number of columns on the battle equal to the resistance factor. So you got to get that thing down there or else you're going to be on an ugly place. And in particular, if you shift below 1 to 2, you do no damage and the defender still gets to shoot you. So you got to be kind of careful there, it looks like. The only leadership modifier is +1 for the side with the highest battle rating. No modifier of tied. Now otherwise, you get the difference in a normal battle, which is what I assumed, or else both sides do more damage to one another. But in this case, it's only a +1. The defender gets +2 to his roll, just indicating the defensive advantage. There's no pursuit or retreat. Only the attacker can claim a major victory. I'm not sure what a major victory means without pursuit. Pursuit's sort of the effect of that. You can look that up. Battle events cannot be played other than siege events that have blue text. A full-strength castle has a combat strength of 3, which is part of its resistance factor, plus whatever garrison's present. A castle on low garrison has a strength of 2. This is indicated on there. If you do a step loss to a castle, that flips it over. If you do 2 step losses, it captures it. Of course, those losses could be taken on the garrisons that are inside instead. For a city, once you get rid of the garrison, if you've caused any step losses in that round of combat, you capture it. So you kind of want to keep garrisons, I guess, in cities. I'm not sure. The game certainly suggests that you do. However, I've seen where that may not be a wise move. I have some thoughts about that. Anyway, the assault succeeds if you kill the defenders off and there was at least 1 step loss, or if the attacker gains a major victory. So if the attacker does double damage, they get the major victory, they win the whole city. Okay, and in that case, the entire enemy force is killed, and the leaders, well, you have to dispose of them. It's possible to send a relief force to attack an enemy army. They get a +1 to their combat check in doing so. That I believe is covered in here somewhere. Attacking besieging units. If your assault fails, the resistance factor goes up by 1. Wow, how do you get those suckers down? Here's what's weird. Resistance factor is partially determined by the number of troops there are, but it doesn't seem to decrease due to starvation, just the number of troops do. The resistance factor isn't recalculated, it's kept throughout. So to me it looks like this is something that you're going to be trying to get, you're going to try to reduce using these cards more than you're really interested in, trying to starve the opponent out. Of course, starving the opponent out makes it easier because if there's nothing, say, in a city, you can attack it, get 1 hit, and you've won. pretty much no matter what. If you lift a siege, if you have no enemy leaders or units in the space containing the stronghold, yeah. And then if you reestablish the siege, the resistance factor is increased. If the besieger leaves the siege space with some of his forces, as soon as he moves out, the defending player can come, or the sieged player can come out and make an immediate attempt to lift the siege in a battle. It looks to me like if you drive the besieger away, you've won the battle, you've lifted the siege. And then the other force continues to move, which may be to come back and reestablish the siege. Garrisons. A castle has an inherent garrison which can be converted to units, and we've kind of discussed this already. You can flip them back and forth and move them around. Once you take someone's strongholds off the board, it's dissolved, that power. So for example, here Aleppo is a power. That would be a fairly light and easy thing to convert compared to the power of the Seljuks, which swings up here, through here, and a little bit over here in this area. Aleppo is its own power, and Damascus is its own power. So you've got, smaller targets you could bite off and weaken the Muslim player with in this scenario. In others, there's going to be much more fragmented states, I think. National characteristics, well, we've already kind of talked about cavalry. Cavalry are these units with 6 movement points. And in this scenario, only the Muslims have them. I think the Mongols are going to have them, obviously. I think some Christian powers will have them at some points in the game. Some of the scenarios have a crusade scheduled for a certain turn. But if the Muslims do well enough, they can prevent the crusade? No. If the Muslims do poorly enough, the Christians will win without having to trigger that crusade. So the Muslims have to make a certain level of success to force a crusade to happen. If they don't do it, well, they've just failed in the entire scenario early. And calculating victory, it's victory points controlled by the player. In this scenario, it's going to be just the Christians who we're worried about for victory points. That's really not important to this introduction. Yes, there's a lot I haven't shown you. There's a lot I don't know yet. We're going to play through at least one scenario of this, I hope, this weekend. Well, no more than one. But yeah, and get a little bit of a taste of it. And then once I'm done with EU, I'll be able to come back to it, give it the full treatment, and, be able to review it from a more knowledgeable stance. All right, well, let's see what we get.